Hi, this is Chris Altrock in Memphis, Tennessee. I want to pass my greetings on to those of you in the Philippines who are watching. I've had so many wonderful visits to the Philippines, and I have so enjoyed worshiping God with so many of you. I'm so grateful that I have this opportunity to share this message with you, and I hope that it's a blessing. And I want to share my greetings to others of you who may be watching this. I pray that this message will be a blessing to you as well. If you have a Bible, digital or physical, I want to encourage you to turn to two books, Exodus and Esther. These two books in the Old Testament will be our focus. My wife Kendra and I love to watch movies. We always try to go see the big blockbusters, the movies that are gaining all of the awards. But this always represents a certain challenge for me because I'm a morning person. It's not unusual to find me up at 4:30 in the morning, busy and active. That means I am not a night person. It's not unusual to find me on the couch at 8:30 in the evening, falling asleep in front of a television show. And so, as a result, if Kendra and I go to watch a movie in a theater in the evening or even at home in the evening, there's a high likelihood that I'm going to miss a lot of that movie because I'm going to fall asleep. For example, we recently sat down to watch a popular movie on Netflix. We turned it on, we sat down on our couch, and I fell asleep for a significant portion of the movie. I had no idea what was going on and had to ask Kendra about it. Not long after that, we went to a movie theater to watch a popular movie. I fell asleep for the first 40 minutes of that movie, and again, had to ask Kendra what was going on when the movie was over. You miss so much when you fall asleep. If you really want to understand what's going on, you have to stay awake. And that's why one of the earliest ways that Christians used to talk about the spiritual life is with this idea of being awake. A follower of Jesus named Paul put it this way in Ephesians 5:13 through 14. But all things are exposed when they are revealed by the light. For everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore, he says, awake, you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. Some scholars believe that the last part of that text was an early Christian hymn or an early Christian confession. And when early Christians were baptized, they believed that others would gather around them, and as that person was brought up out of the waters of baptism, the people who were witnessing would all say in unison, awake, you who sleep, because you miss a lot when you are asleep. And the spiritual life is all about coming awake. Not long after Paul wrote those words, a group of early Christians that we now call mystics tried to summarize the stages that people go through as they follow Jesus. The first and most fundamental stage, they said, is this: awaken. The spiritual life is all about awakening. Being in relationship with Jesus is all about awakening, because you miss a lot when you fall asleep. The Christian mystics wrote that we wake up to three things. We wake up to God. We gain new or greater clarity about who God really is. We wake up to our world. We gain new or greater clarity about what's going on in the world. And we wake up to ourselves. We gain new or greater clarity about who we are, especially in relationship to God and in relationship to what's happening in the world around us. And the sad truth is that many who are first awakened when they enter into a relationship with Jesus then fall right back asleep. Churches are filled with people who were once awake but are now back asleep. One author, David Benner, writes this: many things keep us content with our small selves and block us from becoming all that we can be. None, however, is more important than the fact that most of us go through life as sleepwalkers. Even after a moment of awakening, we tend to quickly drift off again. We awaken when we enter into a relationship with Jesus, and then sadly we fall asleep again, and we miss so much. In 1959, Martin Luther King Jr. gave the commencement address at Morehouse College. In that address, he urged people to wake up. In the sermon, he told the story of Rip Van Winkle. Many of us are familiar with the story of Rip Van Winkle, and what we may remember about that story is that Rip Van Winkle slept for 20 years. But there was another very important part of that story that King draws our attention to, and it's what happened while Rip Van Winkle was sleeping. There was a village where Rip Van Winkle lived, and there was an inn in that village, and in that inn there was a picture of King George III of England. 20 years later, when Rip Van Winkle woke up, that picture had changed. It was now a picture of George Washington. And King notes this: when he started his quiet sleep, America was still under the domination of the British Empire. When he came down, she was a free and independent nation. This incident suggests that the most striking thing about the story of Rip Van Winkle was not that he slept for 20 years, but that he slept through a great revolution. There is nothing, King says, more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. It's one thing to sleep through a movie. It's another to sleep through a revolution. And if the Bible says anything, it says that God has sent Jesus here on earth to bring about a revolution, to bring the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And how tragic it would be to sleep through that revolution. Now, waking up and staying awake, spiritually speaking, is difficult because of the nature of life. And nothing illustrates that better than the book of Esther. The book of Esther stands in contrast to another book in the Bible, the book of Exodus. When you read the book of Exodus, you find the miraculous. God is visible. God is center stage. Even the sleepiest person can see what God is up to in the book of Exodus. Here's just a brief survey of some of the miraculous things happening in the stories of Exodus. So in Exodus chapter 1, baby Moses is rescued from the river by Pharaoh's daughter. In Exodus chapter 3, God appears to Moses in a burning bush. In Exodus chapter 7 through 12, God sends these 10 plagues upon Egypt so that all the people know that God alone is the true God. In Exodus chapter 14, God parts the Red Sea. Now, several authors use the word enchanted to describe what we read when we read a book like Exodus. The Exodus stories are enchanted. God is everywhere. The supernatural is infusing the world. Even the sleepiest person can see what God is up to in Exodus stories. But the problem is that not many of us get to live Exodus stories, at least not all the time. Instead, the stories that most of us live most of the time are Esther stories. And while the Exodus stories are full of the miraculous, the Esther stories are full of messiness. The book of Esther tells the story of an orphaned Jewish girl captured in a war by enemies and then forcibly transplanted to Persia, the most godless and secular nation in the world at that time. Esther endures tremendous suffering while she is in Persia, but eventually she becomes the queen of Persia, and she saves the lives of countless Jewish people who are about to be murdered. Here's a quick look at just some of the messiness taking place in the book of Esther. So in Esther chapter 2, Esther and her family are captured by enemies and forcibly transplanted to Persia. There's the messiness of isolation and alienation. In Esther chapter 1, Xerxes, who is the king of Persia, has a palace that's described as if it were the Jewish temple. And so there's the messiness of political idolatry. In Esther chapter 1, King Xerxes terminates the current queen, Queen Vashti, because of her refusal to act as a sex object. So there's the messiness of sexism. In Esther chapter 2, Esther is abducted along with all of the young women of the kingdom and forced to take part in the king's search for a new queen. So there's the messiness of sexual abuse. In Esther chapter 3, Xerxes' right-hand man, Haman, plots the murder of all the Jewish people. And so there is the messiness of racism. Now, one word that's often used to describe the stories of Esther is the word disenchanted. Exodus presents this enchanted world where God is visible and uses miracles to right everything that's wrong. And the book of Esther presents a disenchanted world where God seems invisible and where nothing wrong seems to be made right. In fact, the word God is never even used in the book of Esther. God seems to be everywhere in the book of Exodus. God seems to be nowhere in the story of Esther. And if we're honest with ourselves, Esther is often the life that we find ourselves living. You know, one of the tragic myths of Christianity is that if you'll follow Jesus, at least the Christianity that's popularized in our world, the myth is that if you'll follow Jesus, then you'll have a life full of the miraculous. God will move every mountain. God will be center stage in your life every day. But the truth from the Bible is that if you follow Jesus, there will be days when no mountain seems to be moved. There will be days when it feels like God is backstage and completely out of sight. And when that happens, when we find ourselves living an Esther life rather than an Exodus life, what we most need is awakening. What we need is some way to wake up and to realize that God is still present. And that's what the book of Esther is really all about. New York Times best-selling author Lisa Wingate puts it this way: "We are faced with disasters, unforeseen circumstances, heartbreak, illness, job losses, betrayal, disappointment in the world, in our church, families, in our own homes. Even when we've tried to do everything right, bad things happen. Life spirals out of control. We end up asking, why? We're left wondering how a benevolent, loving God could possibly be anywhere in such a messed up, seemingly hopeless situation." If you've been there, if those questions seem familiar, if you've traveled through the lonely, dark night of the soul, either on your own or with a friend or loved one, then this book, the book of Esther, is for you. Esther is for you because her story allows you to acknowledge that sometimes life is disenchanted. And it's for you because it allows you to acknowledge that even in that disenchantment, God is still present and active. The book of Esther focuses on two awakenings. Both of them are critical. One is how Esther awakens to the injustice that's happening in her world and God's call for her to be part of righting all of those wrongs. We don't have time in this message to explore that awakening, but it is a critical awakening. Too often the church is asleep to the suffering that's taking place in the world around it, and the church needs to wake up to that injustice. The other awakening is how Esther wakes up to the truth that in spite of all the mess of her life, God is present and active. And that's where we'll focus the rest of our time in this message. Both of these awakenings take place near the center of the book. This racist Persian leader named Haman has put into a plot to eradicate the entire Jewish people. And Esther, this Jewish orphan who becomes queen, is the only person with any chance at all of stopping that plan. But she's scared, and her life is also in danger, and she's not sure what to do. So that's when her adopted father, Mordecai, steps in and speaks to her. His speech to her sparks both awakenings in Esther's life. We'll focus on just that part of the speech that sparks her awakening to the presence of God. In Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, Mordecai says, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a a time as this. Mordecai is proposing that you can look back through all the mess of Esther's life and find that God was working through it to bring Esther to this throne at this moment so that she could save countless lives. He is saying that God was present during the isolation and the alienation when Esther and her family were captured by enemies during this war and relocated to Persia. He's saying that God was present during the sexism of King Xerxes, who would dismiss his queen altogether because she refused to act as a sex object. He's saying that God was present during the sexual abuse that took place as the king searched for a new queen. He's saying that God was present during the racism that led Haman to create this plot to eradicate the Jewish people. God didn't cause any of those messes, but he was present in the midst of them, working to bring Esther to this throne at this moment so that she could save the lives of many people. C.S. Lewis was once writing in the context of World War II. It was a challenging time. Violence, prejudice, and instability seemed to be ruling the world. And it was during this time that C.S. Lewis came up with an image for God. In his writings during this time, he called God the something behind. The something behind. And what he meant by that is that right now, all you can see is the violence, the instability, the prejudice. But if somehow you could look behind what you see, you would find something behind all that. You would find God behind all that at work for the good of humanity. And that's what Esther awakens to through this speech by Mordecai. She awakens to the fact that even in all the messes of her life and all the messes in her world, if you can look behind it, you'll find God there, working actively and compassionately for the good of people. Imagine doing a review of your last year, and imagine making 2 columns on a sheet of paper, the miraculous and the messy. I am certain that for most of you, as you reviewed the last year, there would be more items in your messy column than there would be in the miraculous column. In fact, right now, some of you may be living life in that messy column. But here's the promise of Esther. Even in the pain, God is present. Even when it feels God is hiding, he's as close as your heartbeat. You can look behind the hardest moments of your life, and you will find God caring for you, walking with you, working for your good. Esther awoke to this truth, and so did her people. And in the end, this racist man, Haman, was defeated. But it wasn't an Exodus defeat. There were no plagues sent down on Haman and his soldiers to stop them. There was no burning bush from which God spoke to Esther, giving her instructions on how she could stop Haman. God did not drown Haman and his soldiers in the Red Sea after parting it for Esther and her people. This was not an Exodus defeat. This was an Esther defeat. God worked through the political maneuvering of Esther in the court of Persia. God worked through Haman's pride that became his downfall. God worked through military moves enacted by Esther and by Mordecai. In other words, God won the day through the ordinary workings of the machinery of a secular kingdom. And Esther and her people celebrated all of this in a festival they called Purim. It's described this way in Esther chapter 8. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. See, Purim was a way of continuing to wake up to the truth that behind all the mess of life is a merciful and mighty God working for our good. Purim was, in many ways, the opposite of another well-known celebration in the Old Testament, the celebration of Passover. Passover came at the end of all of those miracles in Exodus, and it became an annual celebration of recognizing just how visible God was, how center stage God was, how miraculous life with God can be. Purim was just the opposite. It didn't come at the end of any miracles. It came at the end of a lot of mess. And it became an annual celebration acknowledging that even though God is not always visible, even though God is sometimes backstage, He's still behind everything that we see and is working for our good. Purim was worship that centered on the truth that God moves in mysterious ways, ordinary ways, slow ways. It was worship that sought to reawaken each successive generation to the veiled presence of God. That's why during the worst days of World War II, Jewish inmates at Auschwitz, Dachau, and other camps would write the entire book of Esther from memory. This is why they would read it in secret, and they would celebrate Purim covertly in the concentration camps. They wanted to testify to their conviction that even there, where God seemed most absent in the world, God was present, and His secluded steps were still worthy of celebration. This anonymous poem was scratched into a wall at Auschwitz. I believe in the sun, even when it's not shining. I believe in love, even when I feel it not. I believe in God, even when He is silent. That's the call of Esther, to awaken to and believe in and celebrate a God who's still there, even if we can't see Him shining. Larry McKenzie is a friend of mine. Some of you know him. He's been on the staff of the Highland Church in Memphis for more than 50 years. A few years ago, Larry had a significant heart attack. It was so severe that some of us weren't sure that he would make it. But after months, he recovered from that heart attack. And then, about a year or so ago, Larry flew to the Philippines to visit Christians there. And when he landed in the Philippines after that long flight from Memphis, he had another heart attack. It was a big heart attack, and many of us didn't know if he would survive this heart attack. And so Christians literally around the world began praying for Larry to be healed. And after a few days, Larry was strong enough to return to Memphis. And he stood before the Highland Church one Sunday, and he thanked people for their prayers on his behalf. It was really a miracle. Larry had been living an Exodus story. But sometimes what we get are Esther stories. Several years ago, on the day before her 8th birthday, a young woman named Carson Head here in Memphis was diagnosed with osteosarcoma. She had 36 rounds of chemotherapy, 5 surgeries, 3 lung thoracotomies, and multiple rounds of radiation. Through it all, Christians around the world were praying for young Carson to be healed. And sadly, after 16 months, Carson passed away. Carson's was an Esther story. And God, though more veiled, was just as present in Carson's Esther story as he was in Larry's Exodus story. You know, I've heard from many Christians during this coronavirus pandemic, and many have said to me that this word disenchanted fits really well. They're having a hard time seeing what God is up to during this pandemic. Now, every once in a while, I've heard from a Christian who's had an Exodus moment during this crisis. For example, if you search on Twitter using the hashtag COVID kindness. You get hundreds of true stories of people who are in desperate need and yet who are receiving resources and kindness and compassion in ways that are astounding, in ways that seem divine. I know of two people, friends of mine, who spent hours sewing handmade masks for healthcare workers in Memphis when resources began running low. When Kendra, my wife, celebrated her birthday in April during the height of the virus here in Memphis, friends of hers decorated their cars with balloons and streamers and writing and made a happy birthday parade in front of our home so that she could have a happy birthday. My friend Jim, who helps lead the largest faith-based healthcare ministry in this country, has worked tirelessly over the last few weeks to provide free COVID testing for some of the most underserved people in Memphis. But for each of those Exodus stories during this pandemic, there's so many Esther stories right now. My son Jacob is one of thousands of high school students whose senior year trips and celebrations have been canceled because of the virus. My twin brother had to furlough 10 of the 14 employees in his nonprofit organization because of the financial impact of the virus. The families of more than 50,000 households in the United States have lost loved ones due to the virus. For many of us, these are the most disenchanted times we have ever lived in. But Esther is urging us to awaken. She urges us to believe that even now, especially now, God is present, God is active. Esther provides us the courage to rise and to live fully because we trust God's loving presence in the midst of all of this. May God bless you with eyes to see this God who is still present in your life and in our world. God bless you.